This is Christmas Car Kerfuffle, Episode 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Zayden swallowed. He focused on creasing the paper so it folded over perfectly. He pressed a piece of tape down. "I'm not very good with bows and ribbons. You want to do that?"
"You go ahead. The kids aren't going to notice anyway. I just like to see the pretty presents under the tree. I'll probably sit for a while after the kids go to bed tonight and admire it."
"You should come down to the live nativity at the Methodist church down by the river. I'll be Joseph."
"Sounds cold."
He laughed as he cut a length of green ribbon. The sweet scent of the spicy candle she'd lit drifted over and mixed with her cinnamon and vanilla smell. He had to remind himself he was wrapping presents because he wanted to be distracted. "Yeah, it'll be cold. Lots of long underwear under the robe."
"I don't think Joseph wore long underwear."
"He is tomorrow night." They laughed together.
"I'll bring the kids by. Probably my mom and Graham, too. What is Pap doing? I could get him."
Somehow, he finagled his way into being in charge of handing out the hot chocolate inside the nice, warm church basement. If you ask nicely, he'll probably sneak you coffee if you want it.
Hot chocolate is perfect.
He held his gift up. The bow was lopsided, but his wrap job was pretty neat.
"Nice,"
she said, glancing up. He set the wrapped present under the tree, then slowly leaned back. It had been bothering him for a while, and he figured the best thing to do was just flat out ask. "You seemed a little upset at me earlier. Was I imagining it?" Blythe kept her hands busy and didn't look up.
"Should I have been upset?"
He noticed she didn't exactly answer the question, which, in his experience, probably meant she actually was upset. "No." He gave his honest answer. Then, because it was late and he didn't want to keep her up because she had to be tired, he grabbed another gift and started wrapping. She allowed the silence to lengthen. Finally, he prompted her. "I think the problem must have had to do with me kissing you. Were you regretting it?" Her face shot up. "No," she said, almost breathlessly. "Good." His mouth twisted up, and the ache in his chest eased. That had been his biggest fear. "I'm kind of hoping I'll get to do it a lot more." Her head was down as she tied a neat gold bow on her gift, but he could see her lips lift. Another good sign. "Help me out, please. If I did something to offend you, tell me. I promise I won't get upset. I'd like to fix it." She didn't answer right away, and he grabbed the last present and began wrapping it. The music purred softly in the background, and he tried to stop thinking about what the issue might have been and just focus on enjoying a peaceful and romantic evening with the woman he'd admired for a long time. By the time she was done wrapping, she still hadn't said anything. She set it neatly under the tree and admired the picture the gifts made for a moment before standing. Zayden put the lid on her box of Christmas paper and ribbon and followed her up. "So, you're not telling me?" He stepped closer. She bit her lip and looked at the tree.
"You got 2 phone calls and you just looked guilty when you answered them."
Her head tilted up and her eyes drilled into his.
"How many women do you have strung out on your line?"
"I'm only angling for one," he murmured, surprised. She had to be talking about the 2 phone calls he'd gotten from Rand. And she was right. He couldn't tell her about them. "I haven't had a woman outside of the family call me on my cell phone for so long, I bet I couldn't even dig up a number on it." She crossed her arms over her chest. The defensive posturing reminded him that Ken had given her good reason to be suspicious of men. He shoved a hand through his hair and blew out a breath. But you're right. I really don't want to tell you who called me.
I don't care, she said.
I want you to care, he responded. She shrugged.
You can have 100 women calling you every day. Fine with me. I just have issues with kissing a man who doesn't limit his girls to one at a time.
It's not one at a time. It's just one. She had to believe him, but her lips pressed together and her arms stayed crossed.
It's fine, Zayden. It's not like you owe me fidelity after we exchanged a kiss or two.
She dropped her hands and turned away.
I just don't want to make a habit of it.
I can't tell you who called. He touched her arm and she stopped, her back toward him. But I promise you it wasn't a woman. She looked over her shoulder with a raised brow. No. He rolled his eyes and pulled. She turned to face him. No, it wasn't a boyfriend either. Ken is such a liar.
I believed you.
He ran his hands up and down her arms. Believe me about this, too, please? Her head tilted, and he noticed the dark circles under her eyes. I need to leave so you can get a little rest. He pulled her gently toward him. Are we good? She nodded. He had to accept that. Tomorrow he could tell her who called and what they wanted, but if he told her tonight, it could spoil everything they'd worked so hard for. I'll let myself out. You lock up behind me and get to bed. He'd hoped for another sweet kiss, but he didn't want an unwilling one, and he didn't want to kiss a woman who didn't trust him, so he turned to go.
Zayden?
Yeah? He looked over his shoulder. She walked slowly to him, coming around and standing in front of him. His heart just about catapulted out of his chest when she slid her arms up his chest and around his neck. Her hands threaded through his hair and her body flattened against his. He groaned.
Can I kiss you goodnight?
She whispered. He bent his head down, a little smile on his face, despite the heat flashing through his body. I'll just let you know now, for any time in the future, if you want to kiss me, just grab me and do it. There will never be a time when the answer to that question is no. His hands glided around her waist, and he pulled her flush against him.
I didn't want you to think that I go around kissing men all the time.
Her hand stilled in his hair.
Actually, I haven't kissed a man since my divorce.
I know.
Really?
Blythe, I can't believe that you haven't known that I've been crazy about you. Of course I know these things. He dropped his head and his lips touched hers, gently, sweetly. Little touches. She sighed.
I'm not going to be able to resist you.
I don't want you to.
Where is this going?
Her eyes popped open.
Don't you think people are going to think that it's weird that I'm with my ex-husband's brother?
People have been talking about how madly in love I am with you for a long time, and they're going to say it's about time you put that poor man out of his misery. She froze. Her entire body stiffened. Her hands landed on his shoulders and pushed.
No, that's not true. You don't love me. You can't. It's too fast.
She backed up. He let her go. She was right. He'd gone too fast and shocked her. Maybe she didn't feel the same. But he wasn't walking back anything that was the truth. I'm sorry. You weren't ready, and I let my big mouth get ahead of me. He shoved his hands in his pockets. I've been waiting on you for a long time. I'm not going anywhere. But I'm not pushing you either. I don't want you with me out of pity or because you don't know how to tell me no. I'm here. I'm ready. As far and as fast as you want to go. But I'm not taking anything you're not ready and willing to give." He turned and walked to the door. As he stepped through, he paused. "I do love you. Have for a long time. Whatever you feel, nothing's changed on my end. I won't make it awkward." Stepping out, he closed the door softly behind him. Hunching his shoulders against the cold, he walked to the car, wondering what it meant that she'd not stopped him and hadn't said anything.
"What's a live nativity?"
Lottie asked as they pulled into the Methodist church parking lot a little after 7 on Christmas Eve. Blythe had been distracted all day, and now wasn't any different. Her mom answered.
"It's where they have real animals and people pretending to be Mary and Joseph and the shepherds."
She pointed.
"Look, I see sheep."
A whole herd of sheep milled about in a makeshift pen that was set up beside a small hut.
"Come on, kiddos, let's walk over."
Blythe looked around.
"Don't touch anything until I ask, but I think you'll be allowed to pet the animals." "Yay!"
Lottie shouted.
"Where's Uncle Zayden?"
Rand asked.
"He should be in front of this building here."
Blythe pulled her gloves up and hunched a little deeper in her jacket. The temperature was well below freezing, and although there was no expected accumulation, random snowflakes fell softly among the milling people. Her children danced around them as they walked over. Her mother leaned over.
"Did Ken call them?" "Not today. He probably will tomorrow." 2 years ago, you didn't hear from them the entire Christmas season." "I know, but that was right after he left." "It was almost a year after he left." "They were still in their honeymoon phase."
"It'll wear off." Blythe appreciated her mother's support, even if it wasn't exactly what she wanted to think about on Christmas Eve. Ken's girlfriend, Sherry, was probably very nice, although Blythe had never heard anyone say so. The words gold digger, fake, and homebreaker had all come up in various conversations. But that was with her friends, and they were probably being nice. Sherry had something that Blythe didn't, apparently. Although Zayden had made her feel cherished and valuable last night, and she admired him, definitely liked him. But love? Was she ready to do love again? Her heart pounded and her palms sweated inside her gloves. Her brain wanted her to stay far away from anything having to do with love, but she was afraid her heart had already made up its mind.
"There's the brother you should have married."
They had come around the corner of the shed beside the sheep. She spun her head and stared at her mother.
"What?" "Zayden. He's the brother you should have married."
Zayden had said last night that everyone knew he was in love with her. She dismissed it as just talking. But what was her mother saying?
"What makes you say that?" "Ken's all studious. He's a doctor and everything, but Zayden is the steady one. He plants his feet and they stay planted. Ken, he studies hard, but he parties hard too."
That was true. Blythe wasn't much of a partier, but Ken had always wanted to kick it up on his days off. Stress relief, he said. Zayden was so laid back and easygoing, he probably didn't need stress relief. She couldn't really picture him partying anyway. Sure, he was funny and enjoyed laughing, but he looked right at home last night wrapping gifts with her. Maybe it was presumptuous, but as they wrapped, she could picture them together under the tree every year. She wouldn't mind. Her mother waved and Blythe looked up. Zayden stood behind the cradle, wrapped in a brown robe. He jerked his head at them and smiled at Rand and Lottie,
Where's Mary?
Lottie asked. Blythe had been wondering the same thing. It was odd to see just Joseph by the manger. She got cold, one of the shepherds said. We tried to get Joseph to warm her up, but he wasn't having any of it, another one said. A horse neighed on the side opposite the sheep.
Hey, look, there's a baby calf.
Lottie pointed between the horse pen and the stable, where two little brown calves snuggled in a bed of golden straw. A couple of chickens perched on the rail fence behind them, and a big mama cow looked on with soft brown eyes, quietly chewing her cud. The kids walked over, joining a group of 10 or so other children.
Are they allowed to pet them?
Yeah, they only brought animals that are calm. Zayden adjusted his headpiece. Larry is there too. He owns the horse, and he's making sure no one gets stepped on.
Okay, that's good.
Zayden, think your sister-in-law would be interested in filling in as Mary? The first shepherd said with a wink. Zayden lifted his brows at Blythe. Don't think you'd have a problem keeping her warm. If her cheeks weren't already rosy from the cold, that comment would have made her face flame like a fire engine. Suspect you're right, Zayden said with a grin, and Blythe actually put her hands on her cheeks. They've got a robe in the church, and they'd love it if you'd stick it on and come out here and kneel for an hour. His eyes darkened. I'll make sure you stay warm. The shepherds howled beside him. They stopped abruptly as another group of people walked around the side of the shed.
Where's Mary?
A little boy asked.
You go ahead, honey. I'll take the kids to my house and you can have Zayden pick them up there.
Her mom whispered in her ear, then patted her arm.
I'll be back.
Blythe walked to the church, glad she'd chosen her warm boots over her more stylish brown leather ones. Zayden could keep everything else warm, but he'd look pretty funny holding her toes in his hands trying to thaw them. The basement smelled like hot chocolate with a hint of coffee hiding in the shadows. Everyone was thrilled she'd agreed to be Mary and she was back out kneeling beside baby Jesus, the only part of the nativity that wasn't real. If it were summer, we could probably get a baby, but it would be child abuse to have a little one sitting out in this cold. She wondered, as she often had after she'd had children of her own, how Mary had managed. Did it get cold in that part of the world? What season was it anyway? She supposed it didn't matter, but they were questions she'd never even considered until her own children had come along. One mother relating to another, she supposed. Only Mary's husband had stood with her. Ken never would have.
But Zayden would.
The little voice in her head whispered softly, even as Zayden's hand settled on her shoulder. The warmth of his legs soaked through her back. She tried to look serene as she stared at the baby doll in the manger, but her emotions roiled around in her head, poking and prickling and keeping her on edge. She didn't want to be with a man just because he'd never leave, but that was definitely a requirement for the next husband. He needed to stick, through everything. Still, what she felt for Zayden wasn't exactly what she'd felt for Ken all those years ago. She was older, for one. Those emotions seemed so silly and schoolgirlish. Her feelings for Zayden came from her woman's heart. She admired his strength of character, his work ethic, his gentleness with her children, his willingness to make a wrong right, no matter the inconvenience to himself. Like her car. He'd driven the whole way to New York in a snowstorm to get it back for her. She blinked. How could she not love a man who would do that? She loved Zayden? Her heart bloomed in her chest, and the feelings that felt so scattered just a few moments ago settled down into a calmness that eased her soul. Yes, she loved Zayden. and she couldn't wait to tell him about it. Tonight. What better night to tell him than Christmas Eve? At least she hadn't acted weird around him. Zayden had been afraid after his early morning declaration that Blythe might be uncomfortable with him, but Blythe had been fine, even seemed happy to see him. They waved a last goodbye to the church folk. "I'll bring the car around, Grandpap," Zayden said. "I'll come with you." Blythe tucked her coat tighter around her waist. She didn't take his hand, which didn't exactly surprise him, with all the people who were watching them. She probably wasn't ready to take anything public. The door closed behind them. A few people still milled in the parking lot, and Zayden kept his hands at his sides, rather than putting an arm around Blythe like he really wanted to. "I'm going to assume that you want to have a little time to get used to the idea of you and me before you tell your children." She shoved her hands in her coat pockets and walked with her head lowered before she blinked up at him. "I'm not ashamed of you. It's just—" He shrugged, shoving off the disappointment. He understood that with children, things could get a little sticky, especially since their father was his brother. "I get it." The words came out a little more curt than he intended, but Blythe didn't comment, and soon they had Grandpap in the car and dropped him off at Zayden's. "I can walk home from here." Blythe got out of his pickup while he helped Grandpap up the walk. "Hang on, I'll walk with you." "You don't have to." His gaze drilled hers. He understood why she didn't want to tell anyone about their relationship, whatever it was. He also understood why she'd be hesitant about even having a relationship after being burned so badly by his brother. But surely she knew and understood that he wanted to spend as much time as possible with her, that he liked spending time with her. "I want to," he said, low and soft. Grandpap opened the front door and shuffled through. "You kids go along. I'm going to heat up some soup." He wagged his finger at Zayden. "Treat her good, son." Zayden stared at Blythe. She didn't look away. "I intend to." A shadow passed over her eyes, like she could hardly believe that someone would respect her enough to treat her well. Or maybe she didn't believe him. But what more could he do to prove to her that he'd be here? She either had to believe or not. The front door clicked closed. Blythe dropped her gaze. Zayden's heart drooped. After a pause, what more could he do? He went down the front porch steps and stopped in front of Blythe. "It's dark, and I don't think anyone will notice if I walk you home and hold your hand. Is that okay?" "Please don't be angry." "I'm not. I get it. You have to keep your kids in mind first. I respect that, and I've worked hard to be there for them. Not only because I love you, but because I love them as well. But you know them best. I know what I want. I've wanted it for years. I can wait." The tight lines on her face relaxed. "Thanks." Her hand slipped into his and a thrill shot through his soul. They started down the block, their linked hands swinging between them. Just inside her mother's gate, she stopped and pulled him off the path. He allowed her to lead him to the old maple tree, a small grin hovering over his lips. When she turned him around and pushed his back against the rough bark, he couldn't stop himself from pulling her into him, lifting her feet from the ground. She laughed, pulling his head down to hers, her lips reaching and searching. They came together in a passionate embrace, her hot body against his, all rational thoughts fleeing. Headlights flashed, and Blythe jerked back. Zayden set her down, and she stumbled back, turning as the car pulled to the curb and the motor shut off. Zayden's chest heaved as his brother stepped out of the car. Blythe gasped. Zayden put his hand out and she turned.
"Leave,"
she hissed. Now? Zayden opened his mouth. He wasn't going to just leave her here to explain everything by herself.
"Please,"
she begged.
"let me handle this. Just leave."
Zayden? Ken squinted. Blythe? Are you sure? He said, his voice barely audible.
"Go,"
she insisted once more. Against everything he'd ever wanted, and against all that he thought he should do, he turned and walked to the back of the house, hopping over the fence and taking the back alley to the next street, striding up the sidewalk away from the woman he loved to his home. Blythe looked out over the street. Snow had started to fall sometime after midnight, and now at just past 2 a.m., the street and yard outside her window were all white. Snow clung to the big old maple. Her heart pounded. Just a few hours ago, Zayden had kissed her more thoroughly than she'd ever been kissed before, right there under that maple tree that had watched her walk up the walk as a new bride on Ken's arm. It had been there the day he'd walked out on her, too. And now, it had listened tonight as Ken had the audacity to inform her that he was stopping in to see his children and didn't expect to see their mother draping herself over some random hookup in the front yard. Interestingly, Sherry had not been with him. She'd allowed Ken to come in and see the children, who had been full of questions. Ken hadn't come right out and declared it, but it had sounded like he and Sherry had a fight, and he'd left her in Cancun. Blythe bit her lip and soothed herself by watching the snow falling against the light of the streetlight. Her children had begged for Ken to come to dinner tomorrow. He'd even offered to pick Graham up and bring her. How could she refuse? And what was she going to do? Zayden would be there. Talk about awkward. Especially since Ken had caught her as he walked out, asking for another chance before kissing her. A shadow drifted through the branches of the tree coming down the sidewalk. She'd recognize that long-legged, unhurried stride anywhere. Why would Zayden be walking down the street at 2 a.m. on Christmas morning? Was he coming to see her? He was headed toward his house, though. Her heart sped up as he passed by her gate. She gasped and took a step back as he looked up, seeming to see right into her window. It was dark. He couldn't see. Surely he couldn't. His stride never slowed, and he turned his head, walking out of sight. What about that phone call that he swore wasn't a woman? She should have asked to see his phone. Was that why he was walking around town in the middle of the night? She couldn't think of another reason that someone would be out and about. Part of her said she was being ridiculous. Part of her said she'd been there before. She, if anyone, ought to know that men cheated. She allowed the curtain to fall back as she turned and slipped into bed. 10 years ago, she never dreamed that she'd be spending Christmas Eve night cold and alone in bed by herself. Tomorrow, there would be 2 men at the table who had each let her know that they wanted to be with her. One had already had a chance. The other had only declared his position because of a mix-up with her car. If that hadn't happened, she still wouldn't know how Zayden claimed he felt. Ken was offering her a chance to put her family back together. Ken's mistake had given her a chance to patch together a new family. She rolled over. Or she could continue the way she'd been for the last 2 years and keep going, by herself. Chapter 7. Zayden helped Grandpap up the walk. Blythe had responded to his Merry Christmas text this morning with a Merry Christmas of her own, but nothing more. And he hadn't been able to bring himself to say any more. Not after Ken's visit last night. The unmistakable scent of vanilla and cinnamon had clung to his coat like blue on a bruise, giving truth to his declaration that he and Blythe were getting back together. Zayden didn't want to get between them if that was really what Blythe wanted. He'd stepped back before, and he'd do it again. For Blythe. They'd barely gotten inside before Graham made her way over and almost threw herself into Grandpap's arms. "Did you tell him?" she asked. "Thought we'd do it together," Grandpap said with one hand on his walker and one arm around Graham. Curious as to what they were talking about, Zayden didn't move from the door. But he'd seen Ken's car outside, parked along the street, with snow on the windshield indicating that it had been sitting there since early this morning, or late last night, and his heart desperately wanted to know where Blythe was. Or, more specifically, if she had allowed her ex-husband back into her life and heart. "What did you want to tell us, Graham?" Blythe asked, carrying a big platter of turkey into the room and setting it down on the table before turning to face the door and wiping her hands on her white, frilly apron. Ken came in right behind her, carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes. Her mother followed with stuffing. Rand and Lottie followed with rolls and cranberries. They formed a semicircle in front of Graham and Grandpap. Zayden felt slightly out of place as he stood off to the side, just in front of the door. Blythe hadn't looked at him. Her hair was down in soft waves around her face, and the red sweater she wore emphasized her light brown eyes. He couldn't pull his eyes away, although he should. Ken put a possessive hand on her shoulder. She didn't shrug it off. "We're getting," Graham started. "Married." Grandpap joined her for the last word. They laced their fingers together and threw their clasped hands into the air. Rand and Lottie screamed, excited just because their Graham was excited. Blythe's mother put her hand to her mouth as her eyes filled. She pushed forward and hugged her mother. Blythe's face glowed. Finally, her eyes found his. Their matchmaking had worked. Ken's arm snaked around her shoulder. She moved, gliding toward Zayden. His chest filled. His feet begged to move, but he kept himself still. She might be coming over to say something benign, or worse. Desperate to hold her, he kept his face impassive. If she wanted him, she knew she could have him. He'd told her so yesterday. He wasn't going to guilt her into any decision she didn't want. "I saw you last night." "I saw you." "At 2 a.m.? He'd meant earlier and shook his head. The house was dark. She'd seen him. He searched out Rand, but he was busy talking to his grandparents. "Rand gave me the picture frame you helped him make." She tilted her head. "That was a beautiful picture of the kids and me. I hadn't even realized you took it." "I didn't think you knew." He shrugged, pressing down on his heart, which wanted to move closer. "The light was perfect, and you looked beautiful as you knelt with your arms around them. After I snapped the shot, I thought you'd like to see it. But Rand approached me about helping him with a Christmas gift, and I thought of that right away." His voice trailed off as she moved closer. "It was beautiful. Thank you." She fingered the pearl necklace around her neck. Zayden didn't recognize it and wondered if it was a gift from Ken. He'd almost always gotten Blythe jewelry for all occasions. "Zayden, Blythe started. "Come on, everyone. Let's eat while the food is hot." Blythe's mother herded Graham and Grandpap to the table. "Uncle Zayden," Rand called. He ran over and threw his arms around Zayden's waist. Zayden knelt, catching Lottie as she tumbled into his arms behind her brother. Her serious face and dark eyes looked so much like Blythe that his heart twisted as he hugged them both close. He'd almost allowed himself to believe that they could have been his. "Merry Christmas, you two." They babbled about their gifts and their mourning and how surprised Blythe was with her gift, as they each grabbed one of his hands and skipped beside him to the table. Ken already sat at the head. Zayden hung back, helping Grandpap scoot his chair in, waiting until everyone else had gotten a seat before he took the only one left, between Graham and Rand. After they prayed and passed the food, Blythe's mother asked Graham and Grandpap about their engagement. Grandpap started telling the story of the car confusion of the day before and how it had thrown him together with Graham, and how they had realized that they each felt the same about the other. "Life is short. Can't waste a minute," Grandpap said, holding Graham's hand on the table. "We're getting married on New Year's Eve, and I'll be moving her in with us." He looked over at Zayden. "I couldn't be happier about that, Grandpap," Zayden said, and meant it. If he were being honest, he'd have to admit to being a little jealous. But he truly was thrilled for Graham and Grandpap. Feeling her gaze like a physical touch, he turned his head to see Blythe staring at him. He forced his mouth to curve into a smile. Their matchmaking efforts had worked better than either one of them had thought they would. "Well, that's romantic," Ken said. "I'm happy for you too, Grandpap." Ken seemed sincere, and Zayden pushed down his annoyance. Blythe wasn't the only one Ken had ignored over the years. Grandpap had pretty much been Zayden's responsibility for a long time. Not that he cared, but Ken had a habit of leaving the people who loved him when something more interesting caught his eye. "But I have news of my own." Ken stood. He lifted a brow, looking at Blythe. "Blythe and I have spoken at length, and we have decided to try again." The back of Zayden's throat closed, and his stomach clenched. Grateful he'd not eaten much, he reached for his water and took a big swallow. Blythe stood. "That's what you decided, Ken." She reached up and unhooked the pearl necklace from around her neck. "I hadn't had a chance to say anything when we were interrupted." She held the necklace up. "Thank you for the thought behind this beautiful gift, but I can't accept it." Zayden's eyes flew to hers. Hope swelled in his chest. 2 years ago, even last year, I would have been all about trying to make things work between us." She set the necklace on the table. "That's not really a discussion for here, though." Her brow crinkled and she looked at her children. Rand chewed with both cheeks bulging out. Lottie's hands were in her lap and she watched with serious, unblinking eyes. Blythe bit her lip as she studied her daughter, and Zayden's chest deflated. Her children would hate him if she chose him over their dad, especially if their dad were begging to take her back. At Christmas dinner, like they'd ever forget that. Every child wanted their parents to stay together. "I just want to say that Zayden and I had the same thing happen as Graham and Grandpap. The car mix-up opened my eyes too, and I realized that there had been someone here all along who had supported me and taken care of my kids." She laughed. "And my car." She touched one finger to the pearl necklace. "Please don't take this badly, Ken. But Sherry is the one you need to be trying to work things out with. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this was meant for her anyway." Ken's cheeks reddened, and he sat down without saying anything. Blythe continued to stand. "Zayden and I are together." Shock ripped through Zayden's chest. He hadn't expected her to just blurt it out like that. He couldn't keep the super-sized smile off his face.
Zayden's going to be our dad now?
Lottie asked in a small voice. No, Ken said shortly.
Not exactly.
Blythe shifted, then slowly sank down into her chair. I'm going to marry your mother as soon as she decides she wants me to, Zayden said in the most conversational tone he could manage.
New Year's Eve,
Graham said, slapping a hand down on the table.
That might be just a little too soon,
Blythe said. Her cheeks turned pink, which made Zayden's smile even bigger. Not for me. Zayden stared at her. She finally looked up and met his eyes. He'd been waiting years. He'd wait longer, until she was sure, but he didn't need any more time to know who and what he wanted. He pushed back away from the table and walked around. Setting his hand on the back of her chair, he leaned over it, whispering in her ear, "Thank you." She pushed back, putting her napkin beside her plate.
Excuse us for a moment.
Taking his hand, she led him into the kitchen, away from prying ears and eyes. The door had barely shut behind him before she turned.
I love you.
His mouth hung open. Pretty much every minute I've been here today, you've shocked me somehow. He cleared his throat. Never thought I'd hear you say it. She smiled.
I love you.
I love you too.
New Year's Eve might be too soon for me.
Whenever. He slid his arms around her and smiled down into her eyes. Bring your car to the shop next week, and I'll see if I can't get it mixed up with the car of someone who lives in Vegas. Her eyes widened.
You didn't do that on purpose.
If I'd have thought of it, I most definitely would have. Especially if I'd have known that it would get me to right here, today. Merry Christmas, Blythe. His head lowered.
Merry Christmas, Zayden.
She tilted her head, and their lips met. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.